Folks, welcome to another episode of The Security Table. My name is Chris Romeo, joined as always by Izar Tarandosh and Matt Coles. And as we were just chuckling about, it is Security Week in the desert right now. And as you can see, all three of us are safely stowed away in our bunkers so that there's what's the concept of in the U.S. government? There's always one person left behind in the bunker.
Designated survivor.
Designated survivor. I can never
Actually,
remember.
a very good series.
Okay. But we are the designated survivors of cybersecurity who are staying out of the desert in case of any other.
June.
It's just some other bigger problems. So, yes, it's Black Hat, B-Sides Las Vegas, and DEF CON week. But we're here.
Besides Las Vegas, where else?
Yeah, well, that could be a whole different episode on leaving Las Vegas. Okay, so Izar, you found an article to tee us up here. So why don't you set the stage? Kind of talk about, give us the background on why this caught your attention.
Okay, so after learning a lot from Matt, from the embedded and hardware side of things, somehow my Google feed, I don't even know how to call the thing on mobile.
Discover.
Yeah, thank you. It picked up on the fact that I have a passing interest on threat modeling and apparently some hardware as well. And it brought me this interesting article from a site called semiengineering.com. Notice that I am being very, very careful with my pronunciation because it's been pointed out to me that my accent may be wrong in some of our past episodes.
Wait, may be wrong. We could unpack that.
I always thought that's part of your charm.
Right? It's what I'm going for. But no, I have to have somebody with even worse accent than me.
You're the South American and European accents we need.
Got it. See, there you go. Somebody value me finally. Anyways, so there is this semiengineering.com site, and they posted an article called "Defining Cheap Threat Models to Identify Security Risk." And
chip, not cheap.
Chip. Yeah, CHIP, like hardware black thingies with a lot of pointy legs on the bottom, not expensive things.
You never met a CPU, did you?
We can go there later, but yeah. No. But anyways, so it begins with experts at the table, right? So it's a group of 1, 2, 3,
Here's our
4,
table.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 experts that begin by answering the question, how do you define a threat model?
And that's where the wheels start to slowly fall off.
Trust me.
Thingy. I have no problem with people having their own definitions. After all, even in the context of the threat modeling manifesto, we agreed on one definition that we said this is not the definition. This is a definition that we all can work with. But if you look at the many presentations that we have out there and writings, you see that each one of us has their own definition, working definition that we use every day to do what we do. But oh my God, I don't want to throw shade on people.
Well, we're not gonna mention any names as to what comments we pulled or whatever. But let me throw this point before we go there. It just hit me. For some reason, the threat modeling manifesto has not drifted into the world of hardware at all, because nobody used our definition, though. At least I'm looking at this as a representative sample of academia, government, and commercial companies, right?
Yeah.
And I would have thought one of these definitions would have been like analyzing representations of a system to understand the security and privacy characteristics. Like, I feel like the manifesto at least in the circles we run in, has driven people towards more of a common definition. But what I'm not seeing that here in any of the answers.
There's a couple that are close, but yeah, you're right. I mean, in looking at the list of folks, some of them are at least aware. I mean, we know that they've been privy to the Threat Modeling Manifesto. I mean, they're part of the same circles, that we run in. So, well, I guess don't read in too much about it. I mean, they could have paraphrased it and not used the definition. Alternatively, they could think there's a better way of describing it, and for some of these, that may be the approach they wanted to take. So let's not read it too much of it. However, if any of them are listening, they're each going to get a copy of the Threat Modeling Manifesto in their inbox.
But Matt, let me ask you something. As my embedded and hardware guru,
You're so doomed. So doomed.
Hey, it's good enough for me. So this point that Chris made, which I agree with completely. Would it be fair to say that it's not only the manifesto, that there is a disconnect in terms of security between the hardware community and the software community? And just point out that something. Once upon a time, in the previous lives, I worked at Intel in a fab and all that good stuff. And
did not know GIL.
Yeah. And I got to look at over the shoulder of people who actually wrote code that described chips and sent it to the wafer machine to actually make the chips. And it's a very powerful language. It's like it's a full language, of course.
Mm-hmm. The HDL you're talking about.
I believe so. I don't remember exactly the details. But I could imagine at this point, not then, but at this point in my life, I could imagine some constructs in that language having a security value and you being able to introduce security faults in the hardware itself by means of the language that's used to define the chip. And to make a long loop shorter, I'm willing to bet that there are no static analysis tools for those languages that cover security cases, for example, because embedded people still see that stuff as not really where we play. Is that true?
It's not entirely true. So there's been work done by various folks. I'd have to pull the research. I know MathWorks has been doing some work in this area. So I'll say, so I used to work I worked briefly at Analog Devices, which of course is a semiconductor manufacturer, designer. There is some work being done in that area. It's interesting too, because threat modeling started in a cyber physical world, with the NIST risk assessment framework. Ooh, get that out today. Where it went through threat modeling of harms, physical harms mostly, and harms to things like national security from physical systems, right? Mostly weapon systems and critical infrastructure and whatnot. So to say that hardware is not up to speed on security is sort of misleading. I will say though, there's two parts. Software definitely ran really far, really fast when it comes to security. But then again, it's sort of like the OS debate. When it comes to cybersecurity, at least, if you use it, they will come. And so software was laden with holes and needed to rapidly advance. And hardware, definitely I think got sort of went head in the sand approach. Where hardware, there wasn't a lot of security research into it, at least not visibly, and it didn't hit billion-dollar industries as quickly, and now it's starting to really take on more focus with a lot of our software being hardware dependent. It always was, right? Running in the cloud, you're running on hardware, but now with specialized chips and GPUs and other things, running on specialized silicon, you have more emphasis now on hardware. You also have side channels and things like that, right? Which have always existed. one of my favorite things about hardware security was a project called Tempest out of the DoD, where if you had EMF emanations from your hardware devices, people could monitor network communications and see what you're reading on screen, and big spy stuff, right? And so hardware has always been part of security, but it's, like I said, software, I think, just ran very fast, very quickly, because they made a mountain out of security vulnerabilities.
I mean, think about the avenue, the vector of attack. Like when we think about what are the biggest hardware issues that we've seen in the last 20 years, they've been Intel chip derived due to, there was the Ghost vulnerability. What was the one before that?
You had the Pentium divide by zero.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remember that one.
Forgot about that one. Okay. But then there was
Well,
another.
So that wasn't technically a security problem, right? That was a chip flaw that resulted in denial, mass denial of service for devices.
What was the one? What was the big one before Ghost? Ghost wasn't as big as the.
We had Rowhammer. You had Rowhammer. You're thinking about Spectre and Meltdown.
Spectre and Meltdown.
Spectre and Meltdown. Just for those who aren't familiar, Spectre and Meltdown is about. Oh my God, it just left my head.
Isn't it the parallel lines of execution?
Yeah, it's speculative execution faults, right? And the ability for somebody to both influence and guess the outcomes. And then you have Rowhammer, which is when hardware devices are manufactured, they're manufactured in layers. There's power and processing, circuitry that are put in the layers. Those layers are getting thinner and thinner and thinner. You may hear them as your nanometer technologies. I think we're at 3 nanometers now. And as they get closer and closer together, it's possible for one layer to influence the other layer. And so in Rowhammer, you have circuitry that is able to flip bits either in memory or either memory or in storage, depending on what you're using for storage, and then do things like gain kernel access or become administrator, because you can flip that little bit that says, "Hey, I'm an admin," and so now you can do that through a web page. So
is that a fair assessment then to say? Do you agree with my statement that the primary hardware attack vectors that we've seen resulting in attacks in the last 20 years have been around the Intel chips?
No, not strictly the Intel chips. So Rowhammer is not an Intel chip problem. It may be an x86. So let's be careful of architecture versus manufacturer, right? Mm-hmm. So x86 is a processor technology. Intel makes x86 chips, but so does AMD and others, right? So the processor technology may be at fault, but the chips themselves either can have additional flaws or are impacted, like a protocol flaw, right? Heartbleed was a TLS protocol flaw, not an OpenSSL flaw.
Okay, so then if we use something like Spectre and Meltdown, what box does that go in? Is that an x86 problem or a specific?
I think those were, if anything that has speculative execution. So I think that was x86 and x64. I don't recall. I have to go back and check. I don't recall if ARM was impacted by it or if they were impacted the same way. But it's certainly x86 and again 32 and 64.
So are there other hardware attacks, other hardware vulnerabilities? Let's say vulnerabilities instead.
There are
other things that just don't get they just don't get airtime. Is that because I feel like I don't know of anything outside of
they do. So there's a whole class of issues around misconfigurations. So a couple of the common ones is so remember just back up for just a sec. So remember with hardware, especially, things get designed. Like hardware is the ultimate waterfall model. Things get designed, they get prototyped, they get built as a test system, and then you mass produce them. And once you start mass producing them, whatever you baked in is baked in until you replace them. So if you misconfigure something like doing things like not baking in a root key to do secure boot, right? So that hardware won't be able to support secure boot. at all, unless it's reprogrammable.
But
And okay, it is.
no. You finished the thought. I'm just getting okay. Yeah, sorry.
So then you also have something called, you have some common interfaces that are used to communicate to the processors, to the chips, things like SPI and JTAG, which is a debug interface, programming interface, and often those are left open or they're left accessible, right? And therefore people can do things like flash new firmware. You can, there's other vulnerabilities.
But those require physical access, though, right? Like the JTAG
it generally requires physical access. But if you can trick somebody into flashing firmware, you can potentially gain access. It depends on how it's connected. Usually that's physical. More recently, there was the issue that was reported around a company's using test boot keys. So they would use secure boot keys that were not intended for public use.
Yeah, we spoke about it last week.
Yeah, and then lastly, you have where was I going to go? Well, yeah. So there's other vulnerabilities. Many of them are public. They often happen in consumer devices, where general consumers aren't going to know, and maybe not even care that their JTAG is exposed, because that JTAG is on a chip that's embedded into a smart speaker
or router
or router or something like that. I'm going to look at that device as a regular consumer. I'm going to look at the device and go, yeah, nobody's getting into that. But there's a whole supply chain discussion we could talk about, because there are
exactly. We spoke about that back when we talked about SBOM, that nobody's going to look at it and say, "Oh, this has XML too. I'm not going to use it." But one thing that you said in there that, and actually the article mentions it as well, is the curve of costs in hardware. So, yeah, true. We got to a point where hardware is getting cheaper by the day, at least at some scale. Right, you can go into Amazon, get a thing like this for like bucks, and do whatever you want with it. But even so, a lot of the hardware that comes out does have the capability of flashing new firmware. And I think that my point is that even though there might be hardware security failures, there is there are two things that I see happening. First, more and more of the functionality is actually regulated by the firmware that it's using. So in other words, if something gets bad, you could potentially reflash the thing and close that issue. Sometimes even at the point of, what's it called? Micro, like the code in the chip itself. It's
microcode controller.
Yeah. Microcode. But the other point is that hardware is getting so cheap that if you're a consumer and you don't want to deal with the security issue that has been found, it's cheap enough for you to unplug the thing and plug the new version.
Why don't we
just replace the device? Or just replace the device. I mean,
that's
why don't we update? I don't ever update firmware. Am I running ancient firmware?
We'll be coming to your house next.
You're missing. No. You're so missing. Like it's the best thing to get like your heart pumping if you don't want to do aerobics. Flashing firmware is an amazing heart pumper.
I remember needing to flash firmware in the old days, but maybe it's just happening behind the scenes. I don't even pay attention anymore.
You don't use an Android phone, do you?
Oh no, I wouldn't.
I haven't rooted one of those in years. Oh my god! but flashing firmware, for example, on your router, right, or on a workday, until you see that red lights turn green, it's like the biggest suspense in your life. You have never experienced the joy of seeing red become green until you flashed the only router that you have working.
Yeah,
until you don't, and you see the red stay red.
Yeah.
And then you're troubleshooting on Sunday night, knowing everybody's going to come in the office on Monday morning and nothing's going to work.
No, because you're on a drive to Best Buy to buy this.
or the best thing is when you're following a how-to, and it says now flash the firmware, and then 2 lines under and says, "Oh, by the way, you should have downloaded this other tool that you need after you," and now you can't because you just flashed the firmware without the tool. So, yay!
That's why you read instructions first all the way to the end, and then you start again.
You were
So-
asking too much already from me to read the first time, like
The
as I go along.
directions, please. The
I can't do
directions
the
are
second time.
the
It should
instructions
be
slash
RTFM at least once.
at least once. The instructions slash directions are the manufacturer's suggested way
Yes,
Indeed.
doing what the operation is. It's not binding. You didn't sign a contract.
No,
Says
it's
I'm
not.
going to follow
It's
the
not.
directions.
You're,
So
you're free to play. You're free to play above the country. Yeah.
let's come back to the article here real quick, because I think one of the answers about how to define threat modeling has a brilliant nugget within it that I
Yes.
found very interesting, and that was, and I
Dun, dun,
quote,
dun.
"We ended up defining a model with 4 attack surfaces, ranging from
Yes.
side channel to supply chain to reverse engineering to malicious hardware." And
Yes,
so I
this one
thought
caught my eye.
that's a heck of a categorization of hardware issues that you would want to be exploring in a threat modeling context for a hardware device, from side channel to supply chain issues with components coming in, to how easy is it for people to reverse engineer this thing I've built, to somebody trying to inject malicious hardware, which is where we kind of touched on that a little bit.
But by the way, I would extend this. A lot of that applies to software too.
Yep.
Supply
Sure.
chain, attack surface.
course.
So when we think
But
of
not
attack
side
surface,
channel. Is there
well,
a
not
side
side-
channel
not
attack in
s-
software?
there are covert channels in software. There are side channels in effect. You can have covert channels in software. So, we know this because covert channels and side channels do exist in the taxonomy of CWEs for software.
Sure.
And so, that was actually really important, I think, because a lot of time when we talk to people about attack surface, they think about the inputs to a system, right? They look at what's coming in, right? User input in particular. Often what gets glossed over, even in the software world, is process to process or machine to process communication. So if you take the hardware as has hardware concepts around supply chain and attack surface and whatnot, and apply that to software, or to mixed hardware and software systems, even better, your attack surface grows. And if you look at attack surface as what you care about, then the security posture of your system and the scope of that exercise grows. That isn't insurmountable. It just is a little more complex.
So I have a question on the supply chain vector. So we had that whole thing a couple of years ago with I don't know how to say the name, the Korean router making thing. Huawei.
Huawei.
That one.
Huawei.
And
Is it Huawei?
It's Huawei's a Chinese.
Yeah. HUA.
HUAWEI.
Yeah, they make 5G and other telecommunications equipment.
Oh, they make everything. But the point is that when that happened, I could see the problem, because it was like this big one new thing with a lot of hardware inside, a lot of software, and fine. It came into my head and sat there nice. But then that moved to cell phones and the actual chipset in there. And then we had, for example, I had this fun thing. I needed an Arduino board for something, and I bought something off of Amazon, and turns out that it was fake. And the way that I found it was when I was trying to program it, the memory space was completely different. Nothing was happening. So, but it was stamped Arduino and it looked nice and everything, but it just wasn't. So my question here is, with hardware security issues, how much leeway is there for a bad thing to happen inside a given chip or chipset? In other words, if I have a problem in the modem in my cell phone, how bad is that actually? What can happen?
Really?
No, seriously, because
let's
my,
let's
my, my,
let's talk
no, no, my,
let's
my
talk
my
about
thing
some
is,
of the let's
no,
talk
no,
about
wait,
some of
but
the impacts.
no, wait. The impacts are clear, but I'm looking at how bad it is in terms of the probability of something happening, because in the chipset,
You mean
the
how
fault is in.
likely?
No, wait. The fault is in the chipset. So immediately we jump and say, oh, it's in the modem. Of course, it can copy all the traffic and send it to wherever.
Yeah.
But
So this is
sending it to wherever
this is the
is
same just debate we're having in software right now about reachability.
no,
So
but it's different. Wait. Having that small piece of code inside a chip where everything is limited, where basically you can't just put an IP in there pointing to some S3 bucket and say, write everything over there, because it's not how the modem itself works.
You're
It's
right.
on a lower level in the stack.
Yeah.
So
So how risky is that? How risky is that vulnerability compared to the thing that it's in? And this is the risk management discussion. This is the attack chain, kill chain, and all the stuff we love to talk about. This is exactly what you're asking, right? That
I
chip
think
has
so.
a flaw. How bad is it really? So it depends on the use of that chip. So if that chip is being used as your radio, sure, it can intercept data. But if it doesn't have access to a processor that can then manage an IP stack, et cetera, then so it's just capturing data. So what, right? And that's problematic, but not necessarily catastrophic. If, however, that chip is your radio and it's used for authentication to the cellular network, and you can use that, and you can potentially, if it has a flaw where you can potentially clone identities, you now have the ability to flood a cellular network, put compromised or rogue devices on the network, and gain significant level of access that you wouldn't have before. And on top of that, there is the whole counterfeiting thing you're talking about, right? So if somebody has the ability to clone an identity and put it on an arbitrary network, there's a lot of money to be made in that. So individual vulnerabilities may or may not, depending on what level of capability those devices have, or that they are within an environment that gives them capability. But that's true if it's software or hardware. This is not a hardware specific problem. This is a hardware. It's important to differentiate, though, a vulnerability that affects a single device versus a vulnerability that affects like a protocol or a chipset, because that's
yeah,
how many millions of devices does it impact? Because hardware usually doesn't affect just one.
You don't
but
just build one? Come on.
but my question stays even at that level of scale. If you have millions or even billions of cell phones out there, and you have a vulnerability at the modem level, in order to exploit that thing, it's almost a nation state thing, right? Unless you're
It
going to the middle
depends.
of the desert and getting a femtocell and whatever.
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends on, does it require an active attack, or is it a firmware problem? Like, in other words, is it a chipset problem that is exacerbated by firmware that gets loaded on every device? Right? There's a number of ways that an attack could occur. Those that require some interaction with the outside in order to trigger an exploit, then yeah, you're probably talking either a well-placed actor, right, insider collusion, or nation state, or organized crime, or a ransomware group or malware group that is building targeted software destined for these devices. That hacked version of Candy Crush that everyone loves to put on their phone, and that gains access, right? So this is, yeah, I mean, it depends on the nature of the issue as to how easy it is to exploit, and then what does it take in terms of number of resources, and then whether you do it at scale or you're targeting a singular device, right? Because if we're going to go after the president or vice president's phone because they're the high value target, versus I want to go after as many consumers as I can get in my net to create a botnet of cellular phones with IP addresses, that's different scale and different.
All right. Well, we're out of time for today, so we'll have to continue this conversation in the hardware space going forward. I don't think this is the last time we'll talk about hardware. Now we've kind of
Nope.
seems like we've kind of opened up something that we could dive a lot deeper into. So let's plan to do that for the future. So, folks, thanks for listening to another episode of Security Table.